I knew the words I should have said. I felt them rise like heat in my throat, then stop, caught behind my teeth as if my mouth had decided it belonged to someone else. There are silences that happen by accident, a missed moment, a note forgotten, a sound drowned by distance. This was not that. This was a silence with weight. It sat on my tongue, pressed against my ribs, made my breathing shallow like I was hiding from something that wasn't even in the room. I remember the pause more than anything else. Not the sounds around it, not the movement of hands or shadows on the walls. The pause, that thin space where a person can still change what happens next, where you can still choose to be heard. I tried to convince myself it wasn't my place, that the air between me and the men who spoke with certainty was a kind of boundary I wasn't meant to cross. I told myself the same thing everyone tells themselves when they feel the ground begin to shift beneath a decision if it goes wrong, it won't be because of me. But even then, before anything had happened, I could already feel the wrongness settling in, like a draft in a closed room, like a crack you notice too late, not because it's loud, but because it changes the way everything sounds after. I watched mouths move, watched confidence pass from one face to another like a shared cigarette. The certainty was contagious. It made the room warmer. It made allowables out of things that should have felt impossible. It turned hesitation into something shameful, something private, something you swallowed, and I swallowed it. I wasn't brave enough to interrupt, not in the obvious way, not by standing up and pointing at what I saw, not by becoming the kind of person who forces a room to stop and look at him. I never wanted that kind of attention. Even then, I knew attention could be fatal, but it wasn't only fear of punishment. That was the excuse I liked best, because it sounded practical, even respectable. The truth was quieter and worse. I was afraid of being wrong, afraid that I would speak, and the men who believed they were unshakable would turn their eyes toward, not angry, not cruel, just disappointed, as if I had broken some unwritten rule by doubting what they had already agreed to believe. I had seen what that look could do to a man. It could erase him without a word. It could make him smaller in his own mind, until he stopped offering anything at all, until he began to live like a shadow, grateful just to remain in place. So I practiced my silence the way other men practiced their signature. I made it neat. I made it obedient. I arranged my face into something neutral, something harmless. I learned how to listen without reacting, how to nod without committing, how to keep my eyes steady even when my thoughts were not. Still, there were moments when the warning pushed up again, a sharp thought, a small detail that didn't fit, a simple conclusion that made my stomach tighten. Each time, the same argument returned. Say it and become visible. Stay quiet and remain safe. Safety was never guaranteed, but it was familiar. Silence had rules. Speech had consequences you couldn't measure. The hardest part wasn't holding my tongue. The hardest part was the way my body betrayed me while I did it, the way my fingers went cold, the way my jaw ached from being clenched too long, the way my heart seemed to strike against the inside of my chest like it was trying to get out first, trying to run ahead of what I was about to let happen. I can't tell you when the choice was made. Not exactly. There wasn't a single dramatic second where I decided to keep the warning to myself and felt the world tilt. It was smaller than that. It was a series of tiny retreats. A glance away, a breath held, a thought dismissed. Each one so minor it seemed forgivable. Then suddenly, the silence wasn't something I was doing. It was something I had become. And by the time I understood that, I was already quiet. The first time I noticed how dangerous the place was, it wasn't because of gunfire or smoke. It was because of how people spoke when they thought they were being careful. Voices stayed low even when there was no one nearby. Jokes were measured, trimmed of anything that might be mistaken for criticism. Words that should have been simple, questions, doubts, objections, were treated like loose ammunition. Everyone handled them as if they might go off in the wrong hands. The building we moved through each day wasn't impressive from the outside. It didn't need to be. It had the same washed-out look as everything else the war had touched. Edges softened by weather and repetition. Windows darkened to keep light from traveling. Inside, the air carried ink, oil, damp wool, and the stale heat of too many bodies forced to share the same. Paper lived everywhere. It stacked, curled, shifted, and multiplied till it felt less like a tool and more like a presence. Orders, reports, maps, lists, names, numbers, lines drawn with conviction. People walked with purpose, because purpose was safer than uncertainty. Even when they didn't know what they were doing, they looked as if they did. No one wanted to be the one who hesitated in a corridor. Hesitation invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention was its own kind of risk. I existed in the seams of, close enough to the conversations to hear them, far enough from the center that no one waited for my opinion. I carried things. I copied things. I translated noise into neat rows of words. I watched decisions pass over my head like heavy clouds, low enough to feel their shadow but too high to touch. There was a pattern to it, the way authority moved. Men with certainty entered rooms without knocking. Men without it waited outside until someone remembered they existed. A sentence spoken by the right voice could change the shape of a day. A sentence spoken by the wrong one could end a career, or worse. Because in war, careers weren't merely jobs. They were identities. They were protection. They were the only proof that you belonged where you were standing. The chain of command was not just hierarchy. It was a weather system. It changed the pressure in every room. You could feel it in how chairs were arranged, how long it took someone to sit, how quickly a cigarette was lit and extinguished. Even when a superior said nothing, the silence around him was different, more deliberate, more owned. The men who gave orders were not always loud. Some were quiet, even polite. That made them more frightening, not less. Loud men could be predicted. Quiet men could surprise you. And there were rules no one ever wrote down, rules everyone learned anyway. You did not contradict in public. If you had to disagree, you did it carefully, as if you were offering an option rather than pointing out a flaw. You did not speak unless you were spoken to. You did not volunteer information unless it was requested. A warning offered too freely looked like arrogance. A concern expressed too plainly looked like weakness. Either could be punished, even if the punishment wore the clean disguise of discipline or order. Punishment didn't always come in the form of shouting. More often, it came as subtraction. A man stopped being asked into rooms. His desk moved to a colder corner. His paperwork and his name began to be spoken with a certain tone, the one that meant, watch him. He thinks too much. He complicates things. He slows us down. In war, slowing things down was treated as betrayal. We worked in cycles of urgency. There were days when everything moved at a crawl, where hours were spent waiting for messages that never arrived, or reading reports that said nothing new. Then there were days when time seemed to collapse. Orders arrived in quick bursts. Officers moved through halls like sparks. Someone would pin a map to a wall, and suddenly the room would fill with bodies and breath and tension, as if the paper itself had summoned them. Those were the moments when speaking felt most dangerous. Not because anyone threatened you outright, but because the momentum of decision became its own authority. Once a plan began to form, it gathered loyalty around it. Men leaned toward it. They wanted it to be true. They wanted it to work. Wanting can be a kind of blindness. You could see it in the way they looked at the map. Not as a representation, not as a guess, but as a promise. Lines traced with fingers became roots, became outcome. A circle drawn around a position became a certainty that something would be there when the time came. And if someone suggested otherwise, the room would stiffen. Not because the suggestion was wrong, but because it was disruptive. Disruption was treated like sabotage. I watched how language was used to make fear sound respectable. They rarely said, I'm afraid. They said, unacceptable risk. They said, insufficient information. They said, we cannot afford hesitation. Every emotion was dressed in formal clothing before it was allowed into a discussion. That is how the system protected itself. It took the human part and wrapped it so tightly in procedure that it could pass as strategy. The officers, those who carried the weight of authority, were not all the same. Some looked exhausted all the time, as if the war had settled into their bones. Some carried themselves like they were still young enough to believe in clean outcome. But even the most tired ones had something in common. They hated uncertainty more than they feared loss. Loss could be counted. Loss could be written down. Uncertainty was endless. The men below them felt it too. There was a constant pressure to appear useful. Useful meant obedient. Useful meant not asking questions that would slow the machine. If you asked the wrong question, you weren't just questioning an order. You were questioning the competence of the person who issued it. And competence was the only currency that mattered. In that environment, truth did not always win. Truth was often soft-spoken. It arrived in small details, inconvenient facts buried in routine reports. It hid in the margins, in misaligned numbers, in a delay that didn't make sense, in a phrase that sounded too confident. You learned to read between lines not because you wanted to, but because sometimes the lines were where the lies were printed. I had learned, over months, how to spot the difference between an honest mistake and a dangerous assumption. The honest mistakes were sloppy. They contradicted themselves. They showed confusion. Dangerous assumptions were smooth. They read like someone trying to make reality fit the shape of their plan. It was in those smooth places that my unease grew. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It was more like a low ache that never went away. A sense that something was being held up by confidence alone. I saw it in how quickly certain reports were dismissed. how certain questions were brushed away with a glance, how often someone would say, "That won't be a problem," without actually proving it. And I saw the way men around the table would nod, not because they were convinced, but because nodding kept them safe. Nodding made them part of the agreement. It erased the possibility that they might have known better later. When you are surrounded by agreement, doubt begins to feel like a personal failing. You start to wonder if you're the only one who doesn't understand. You begin to suspect that your hesitation is weakness, that your worry is just your own lack of faith in the system. The system encourages that. It needs you to think your fear is yours alone. I remember one afternoon in particular, not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. A room full of men, paper spread across a table like a second skin, voices moving over it. I stood near the edge, as I always did, close enough to hear, close enough to be useful if asked, far enough to be ignored. A message had come. Someone read it quickly. Someone else repeated it, slower, with emphasis. The room adjusted itself around those. You could feel it, the plan tightening, the assumptions snapping into place. I noticed something small, a discrepancy. Not a dramatic contradiction, just a difference that shouldn't have been there. A detail that suggested the situation outside the room did not match the picture inside it. It made my mouth go dry. I could have said something then. It would have been easy in a way. Just a sentence. Just a quiet correction offered at the right moment. But as I looked at the faces around the table, I saw the atmosphere they lived in, the certainty they needed, the impatience for anything that might complicate what they had already decided, and I felt the old pressure return, the invisible hand that pushes words back down. I told myself there would be another chance, another moment, that someone else would notice, that it wasn't my job to shake a room full of authority with one inconvenient detail. I stood where I was, holding the silence like a tool I had learned to use. And when the room moved on without me, I moved with it, quiet, obedient, and already practicing the cost of what I would not say. After that, the silence stopped feeling like a single decision and became a habit I carried with me. It followed me through corridors, settled beside me at my desk, waited with me during long hours when nothing happened and everything felt possible at once. The more I kept quiet, the easier it became to believe that quiet was my natural state. But the thoughts did not stop. They arrived uninvited, usually at the worst times, while I copied reports, while I stood in line for meals, while I lay awake listening to the building breathe around me. They arrived fully formed, sharp and precise, pointing to the same conclusion again and again. Something was being misunderstood. Something important was being assumed away. Something was moving forward on confidence alone. I began to replay conversations in my head, not as they had happened, but as they might have gone if I had spoken. I imagined myself clearing my throat, choosing my words carefully, framing the concern as a clarification rather than a challenge. I imagined faces turning toward me, not hostile, just attentive. I imagined a pause, a reconsideration, a small adjustment that would ease the pressure in my chest. Those versions never lasted long. They always gave way to other visions, harsher ones. A superior narrowing his eyes. Someone asking me, calmly, how long I had known, why I hadn't raised the issue sooner, whether I was certain of my information, whether I was prepared to take responsibility if my doubt delayed an operation or undermined morale, whether I understood the implications of what I was suggesting. Responsibility was a heavy word in that. It was never shared evenly. Those who spoke last often bore the most of it. I imagined myself stumbling under those questions, my certainty thinning as it was examined, dissected, weighed against rank and experience. I imagined my concern being labeled caution, then pessimism, then obstruction. I imagined my name being remembered not for what I noticed, but for when I noticed it. And I imagined what would happen if I was wrong. That fear was the most effective of all. If I stayed silent and things went badly, I could tell myself that it was inevitable. That forces larger than me were at work, that no single voice could have changed the outcome. But if I spoke and the concern proved unfounded, then the failure would be personal. My hesitation would have cost time. My doubt would have disrupted certainty. My voice would have left a mark I could never erase. So I argued with myself in fragments. You don't know enough. You know enough to be uneasy. Uneasy isn't evidence. Evidence doesn't always announce itself. Someone else will catch it. What if no one does? The arguments never ended. They circled the same ground until the words lost their edges. I learned to interrupt them with routine. Routine was a blessing. It gave my hands something to do while my mind ran ahead without permission. There were moments, though, when routine failed me. Sometimes it happened in rooms full of people. A sentence would be spoken, confident, definitive, and I would feel my body react before my mind could intervene. a tightening in my stomach, a pulse in my ears, a sudden clarity that cut through all the rationalizations I had built. This is wrong. The thought arrived whole, without qualifiers. In those moments, the path forward seemed obvious. Speak, say the thing, interrupt the flow, let the room deal with the discomfort. And every time, I hesitated just long enough for the moment to pass. It wasn't only fear of authority that stopped me, it was the fear of isolation. Speaking would separate me from the quiet agreement that bound everyone else together. Silence was communal. It was shared. It allowed you to belong without effort. Speech would have made me alone. I had seen what happened to men who stood alone. They didn't vanish immediately. That would have been merciful. Instead, they lingered in a kind of professional twilight, still present, still working, but never quite trusted again. Their words carried an invisible warning label. Their concerns were heard politely and ignored efficiently. I told myself I was not like them, that I was more careful, that my silence was strategic, not cowardly, that there would be a right time, a safer time, when speaking would be useful instead of dangerous. That time never arrived. As the days passed, the unease sharpened. New information filtered in, piece by piece. Never enough to force a reckoning, always enough to deepen the sense that something fundamental was being overlooked. Each new detail felt like another weight added to a scale no one was watching. I began to notice how my body reacted to certain words, how my breathing changed when assumptions were stated as facts, how my shoulders tensed when someone dismissed a concern too quickly. These reactions were private, invisible. They became my only form of protest. At night, the arguments grew louder. I would lie still, replaying the same question. What if this is the last chance? What if silence now means something cannot be undone later? The thought would tighten my chest until it hurt. I would sit up, convinced that the next day I would finally speak, that I would find the courage I kept postponing. Morning always brought relief and shame. In daylight, the fear rearranged itself into something manageable. The risk of speaking loomed larger than the abstract danger of staying silent. The war had taught all of us to prioritize immediate threats over distant ones. Immediate threats had faces. They had consequences you could see. Distant ones required imagination, and imagination was easy to dismiss. I told myself that my responsibility was limited, that my role did not include correcting decisions made far above me, that my job was to execute, not to question. These thoughts came easily because they were echoed everywhere. They were the language of survival. Still, the moments when I almost spoke became more frequent. A hand hovering just above the table, a breath drawn too deeply, a sentence forming in my mind with careful precision. Each time, something stopped me. A look exchanged between superiors, a subtle shift in the sense that the decision had already moved past the point where words could reach it. Silence, I realized, was not passive. It was an action. It required effort, discipline, and constant reinforcement. Each time I chose it, it became heavier, more deliberate. It wrapped itself around the future, shaping what was possible and what was not. I began to understand that by not speaking, I was participating. That realization frightened me more than any imagined punishment. It meant that I was no longer merely observing a flawed path. I was walking it. And still, I said nothing. Not because the doubt faded, not because the fear went away, but because the space in which speech might have mattered grew smaller each day. And I kept telling myself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, I would speak. Tomorrow, I would warn. Tomorrow became a way of surviving the present. And silence continued to grow, filling every space I left empty. The moment arrived without ceremony. No drumbeat, no raised voices, no sense that history was about to narrow itself to a single point. It came the way most irreversible things do, quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as just another step forward. We were gathered again, closer than usual. The room felt smaller, though nothing had changed. The air was thick with concentration, with the particular kind of stillness that settles when men believe they are about to finish something. Papers were aligned, hands rested flat on the table. Someone cleared his throat, not to speak, but to signal that speaking was about to begin. As the order was read, I felt the words strike me differently than they did the others. They landed with weight, pressing against the unease I had been carrying for days, weeks, longer than I cared to admit. Each sentence confirmed what I already knew, but had refused to name out loud. The assumptions were still there. The gaps were still there. The small detail I had noticed, once easy to dismiss, now stood at the center of everything, impossible to. My body reacted before my mind could assemble an argument. My hands went numb. My pulse thudded low and heavy, like it was trying to slow itself down. I became acutely aware of my own presence in the room, of the fact that I occupied space, that I had a voice, that nothing but my own restraint was preventing me from using it. This was the moment. Not later, not after another report, not when more information arrived. This was the narrow opening I had been waiting for, the place where a warning could still interrupt momentum. I knew it with a clarity that frightened me. I could already hear how I would begin. Not forcefully, not accusing. Just enough to draw attention to the flaw. Just enough to ask whether something had been overlooked. The words arranged themselves carefully in my mind, polished by all the nights I had spent rehearsing them. I drew a breath, and then I saw the faces around the table. Not hostile, not aggressive, focused, committed, ready. These were men who had already accepted the weight of what they were about to set in motion. Men who believed that doubt, at this stage, was a luxury they could no longer afford. Their attention was forward-facing, fixed on execution, not reconsideration. If I spoke now, I would not be offering help. I would be introducing delay. I would be forcing them to step backward when everything in the room was pushing them forward. I would become the obstacle they had no patience for. The realization hit me with physical force. My chest tightened, my jaw locked. The breath I had drawn stayed trapped inside me, shallow and useless. Someone looked in my direction. Not at me exactly, just past me, as if confirming that everyone who needed to be present was present. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met. There was no invitation there, no opening, just acknowledgement. That was when I understood that silence was no longer a default. It was a choice that demanded commitment. I felt it settle in my body, heavy and final. The way your muscles tense when you decide not to move. The way pain sharpens when you choose to endure it instead of reacting. I lowered my gaze, just enough to break the connection, just enough to remove myself from the moment. The order was affirmed. A pen moved across paper. The sound was small, almost insignificant, but it cut deeper than anything else in the room. Ink sealed what hesitation could no longer touch. Around me, chairs shifted. Men stood. The room exhaled, relieved. The decision had been made. The machinery could continue without interruption. I remained where I was, perfectly still. No one noticed my silence. That was the cruelest part. The world did not pause to acknowledge what I had withheld. There was no sense of loss, no visible fracture. Everything functioned exactly as it was meant to. Inside me, something collapsed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden rush of guilt or fear, just a quiet recognition that the line had been crossed. Not by the order itself, but by my refusal to challenge it. The warning I carried no longer belonged to the future. It belonged to the past. As the room emptied, the noise returning slowly, I felt detached from my own body, as if I were watching myself from a distance. I gathered my papers. I followed the others. I performed the motions expected of me with mechanical precision. But the silence stayed behind, anchored to that table, to that moment, to the breath I never released. I knew then, with an understanding that left no room for comfort, that whatever followed would no longer be shaped by chance alone. It would carry my quiet with, and nothing I said afterward would ever sound the same. The first signs came slowly, so slowly that no one wanted to call them signs at all. Reports arrived with language that felt careful, almost apologetic. Phrases softened at the edges. Numbers were presented without emphasis. Delays were explained as temporary, manageable, expected. Nothing that demanded alarm. Nothing that justified panic. Just enough to make the room a little quieter each time the papers were read. I recognized the pattern immediately, not because it was new, but because it matched the shape of what I had feared. I read every line twice, sometimes 3 times. I searched for the place where optimism outweighed evidence, where explanation became excuse. Each time I found it. Each time, it confirmed what I already knew, but had locked away the moment the order was signed. No one asked for my opinion. That was normal. But no one asked the questions I had once rehearsed either. The system moved forward, correcting small errors, absorbing losses, adjusting language, never direction. At first, I told myself it was still too early. That initial friction was expected, that no plan survived contact with reality intact. These were things everyone said, and they were often true. They were also convenient. Then the tone changed, not abruptly, gradually. The confidence drained from sentences. Words like unexpected and unclear appeared more often. References were made to conditions that should have been known beforehand. Assumptions were quietly revised, never acknowledged as assumptions at all. I felt each change like a tightening wire inside my chest. There were moments when conversations stopped mid-sentence, when someone would glance at a report and fall silent, as if recalculating something they hadn't intended to examine so closely. In those silences, I felt the echo of my own. Mine had come first. Mine had made room for the. I began to notice how often people avoided looking directly at one another when certain topics were raised. How voices lowered again, not out of caution now, but out of something closer to dread. The building felt heavier, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were absorbing what could not be said aloud. The confirmation did not arrive as a single revelation. It came in fragments, a message that contradicted earlier assurances, a request for resources that should not have been necessary, a quiet acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, though no one would yet say how. Each fragment landed where my silence lived. I watched men work harder without understanding why their effort wasn't enough. I watched authority tighten its grip, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of losing control of a narrative that no longer fit reality. The same certainty that had driven the decision now refused to let go of it. Admitting error would have required retracing steps. Retracing steps would have meant confronting the moment when doubt could have mattered. That moment had passed. No one wanted to look at it too closely, least of all me. There were nights when I sat alone with the documents spread out before me, arranging them in the order I wished someone else had seen. The sequence made sense that way. It told a clear story. A story that began long before consequences became visible. I imagined placing that story on the table, watching others follow the logic, seeing the realization dawn. But the imagination always ended the same way. Too late. The damage already woven into the present. Silence does not end when the order is given. It multiplies. It adapts. It finds new reasons to persist. As consequences deepened, the cost of speaking grew higher. A warning now would not prevent what was unfolding. It would only assign blame. And blame, in wartime, is rarely precise. It spreads. It stains. I understood then why people stay quiet even when proof surrounds them. Speaking no longer feels like responsibility. It feels like accusation. And accusation invites defense, not correction. The confirmations continued. They came in the form of revised objectives, then revised explanations for those revisions. They came in the way certain names were mentioned less often, in the way absences accumulated without comment, in the way optimism became forced, then brittle, then rare. I saw my fear reflected back at me through the system. The same instinct that had kept me silent now shaped the response to failure. No one wanted to be the first to say the thing that could not be unsaid, and so the machine pressed on, carrying its mistakes forward, compounding them with each attempt to avoid looking backward. There was a moment, quiet, unmarked, when I realized that what I had feared was no longer theoretical. It had become fact, not all at once, but undeniably. I felt no shock, no dramatic surge of guilt, only a deep, hollow certainty. This is what the warning was for. I began to carry that certainty with me the way one carries a private injury, carefully, invisibly. I did my work. I followed instructions. I listened as explanations were offered, revised, and offered again. Inside, the knowledge settled into something permanent. The disaster was no longer approaching. It was unfolding, and my silence was already part of its history. Time did not soften it. That was the first thing I learned. I had expected memory to blur the edges, to rearrange the sequence into something less precise, less accusing. Instead, it preserved the moment with an accuracy that felt deliberate, as if my mind had decided this was one thing it would never allow me to forget. I can still feel the room as it was, before the consequences had names, the weight of the air, the exact distance between my hands and the table, the breath I held because releasing it felt like a commitment I was no longer capable of making. Other memories fade, compress, lose their order. This one remains intact, untouched by time. Long after the war moved on, long after places changed, buildings emptied, and voices fell silent, I found that the quiet followed me. It appeared in ordinary moments, uninvited, in pauses between conversations, in rooms where nothing at all was at stake. It was never loud. It never announced itself. It simply arrived and waited, the way it always had. People assume guilt comes with noise, with confession, with visible suffering. Mine did not. Mine was internal, persistent, and strangely disciplined. It did not punish me all at once. It worked slowly, revisiting the same point from different angles, asking the same question without ever expecting an answer. Why didn't you speak? I learned there are many ways to remain silent after the moment has passed. You can avoid the subject. You can reframe events. You can tell yourself that outcomes were inevitable, that systems move beyond individual influence. I tried all of those. None of them worked for long, because the truth was simple, and simplicity is difficult to escape. There was a moment when words still mattered. I was there, and I chose not to use them. I never claimed responsibility. No one accused me. That absence of judgment became its own sentence. Without accusation, there was nothing to defend against. Without defense, there was no relief. The silence was never challenged, and so it never ended. Sometimes I wonder who I would have been if I had spoken. Not whether the outcome would have changed, I learned to stop asking that, but who I would have become in that instant. A different man, perhaps. One who accepted the risk of being wrong in exchange for the certainty of having tried. That man exists only in imagination. The man who remained is the one who learned how heavy quiet can, how it settles into the body, into posture, into the way you pause before answering even the simplest question. I learned to measure my words carefully, not because I feared punishment anymore, but because I no longer trusted silence to be harmless. Some nights, I still rehearse the sentence I never said. It has changed over time. Shortened, clarified, stripped of everything unnecessary. Now it is almost nothing, a single thought, a simple warning. It would not have been dramatic. That is what stays with me. History is often shaped by loud moments, by declarations, by visible acts, by decisions that leave records behind. But there are other moments, smaller ones, that leave no trace except in the people who lived through them. Moments where nothing happens outwardly and everything happens inside. Mine was one of those. I have lived long enough to understand that silence does not end when the danger passes. It becomes part of you. It alters how you remember, how you listen, how you stand in a room when someone else is speaking with confidence. Even now, when I hear certainty spoken too easily, something tightens in my chest. Not fear, recognition. I know what it costs. There is no lesson in this. No balance to restore. No final understanding that makes the weight easier to carry. The war took many things from many people. This is what it took from me. A voice I once had. And the knowledge that there was a moment, brief, fragile, and entirely human, when using it, might have changed how I remember myself. That is the silence that followed me, and it has never let me go.